let's talk about a fight that you and I have both talked about, and that is Anthony Joshua versus Charles Martin.
Yeah.
This is obviously a very big fight. A lot of people have speculated that maybe this fight came a little bit too early for Anthony Joshua. Maybe they overlooked Charles Martin. Maybe they slept on Charles Martin a little bit. He's kind of an unknown guy, but we will see what happens in that fight. Now, what we're going to do is what we do often in boxing and play matchmaker. Let's go ahead and pretend that Anthony Joshua does handle business, that he goes in there dynamic fashion, gets the win, comes out the new IBF World Heavyweight Champion. What are some fights out there that you think Anthony Joshua may take on, and how risky do you think those fights are? Because obviously so many names are being thrown out there. You know, we've heard Tyson Fury unification. You know, we've heard David Haye. We know David Haye is chomping at the bit to get involved in that fight with Anthony Joshua. You know, Joseph Parker, same with him. Well, so many of these different names that are just being floated out there. You know, what do you think of some of these potential fights, and which ones do you think are risky for Joshua?
Well, if I was playing matchmaker, I think that Anthony Joshua versus either David Haye or Tyson Fury, either one of those fights, has the potential to be the biggest fight in British boxing history. I think it is that big. However, I don't think Joshua is ready for those opponents yet. I think Joshua doesn't think he's ready. I don't think Eddie Hearn thinks he's ready. And I think that's fair enough. You know, he's only had 15 fights at this stage. He probably isn't ready for those guys. So what I'm getting at is I think those fights are massive, massive, massive fights for summer 2017. And I think the amount of revenue that those fights can generate, you know, they would easily sell out 80,000 seats at Wembley Stadium. They would easily do, you know, maybe even 1 million pay-per-view buys in the UK. I think they are probably going to protect Anthony Joshua between this fight, if he were to win, and summer 2017 to make sure there is very, very, very limited risk to him losing and those gold mines in the future being affected. Now, with the way the UK market's working, Anthony Joshua has been built that all of his fights from now on are going to be on pay-per-view. And for me, the sensible and obvious way that Eddie Hearn and his handlers are going to be able to keep Anthony Joshua on pay-per-view and selling out arenas is by using domestic opponents, because the British public know the opponents, you know, they buy into that domestic hype, domestic grudge match, etc. So I suspect we will see Anthony Joshua face a domestic opponent following on from Charles Martin, and I think there's 4 options for that. Option 1 is Derek Chisora. We know that Matchroom have already made efforts to get a fight with Derek Chisora, and I think they'd possibly look to do that again. I think Chisora would be most likely to take the fight if Joshua has the belt. The one risk there is Chisora's already got a fight booked against Kubrat Pulev, and he could easily lose that fight. So if he lost the fight, he'd be out of the running. Option 2 is David Price. We understand David Price is having a comeback fight in April. If he can put 1 or 2 big wins together, you know, David Price, he's a big guy, he's a very big puncher. If he got some momentum, perhaps that could be a fight. Option 3 is Hughie Fury, Tyson Fury's cousin. Apparently Eddie Hearn has made 1 or 2 attempts to get Hughie Fury in against Joshua. You know, Hughie Fury's still very young. I understand he's going to have a very big fight in March against the yet unnamed opponent, but maybe he could be one to look at. And option 4 is Dillian White. You know, Dillian White is out of action, he's injured, but he'll be back autumn this year. Maybe there could be a rematch there. There's such hype and feeling even after their first fight that I think Eddie Hearn will look to go domestic, and I think it'll be one of those 4 names.
Well, those are some great points that you brought up, and actually I agree with you. I think that that's probably the smartest route for Anthony Joshua to go, for the same reason. If you're Eddie Hearn, you want to protect your investment.
Yeah.
You don't want to rush and throw him out there with David Haye and all of those fights. Those fights aren't going anywhere, right? And besides, at the end of the day, you want to build up to those fights, right? So what you want to do is you want to take these fights here that are going to bring in, you know, 4, 5, 6 million, you know, and keep building up. You know, Joshua's fan base right now just continues to grow. This guy is a lightning rod. He's big even in the U.S. This guy is really getting his name out there. And obviously a win here over Charles Martin, and obviously his star is going to continue to rise to the top. So I'm with you on that. I say go domestic. Now the question is going to be, are these guys willing to fight them? And obviously I think that they will, because this is the route that you have to go if you want to get paid in the heavyweight division. Anthony Joshua is definitely the golden goose, which is part of the reason why I think both of us have said that, this fight between him and Charles Martin probably came too early, because every title holder in this division already is going to want to fight Anthony Joshua, right? So there's no real rush to go after the title. But for whatever reason, I guess, Eddie Hearn and his team saw a weaker champion, and they're going to try to pounce on Charles Martin. And we will see. I'm hoping Joshua pulls it out. But some options for Joshua, like you said, Derek Chisora. Eddie Hearn has already approached Derek Chisora, and Derek Chisora didn't want to take the fight for whatever reason. I can't see why. I mean, maybe he thinks that if he loses to Joshua at this stage, his career is over. But that being said, he could take a loss to Kubrat Pulev, as you brought up. So very risky business on the part of Derek Chisora. But that's a fight that I'd love to see. Chisora is entertaining. And I think that would really make for a good pay-per-view that you could really build up. Chisora is going to get in Joshua's face. He's going to talk trash, and we're going to get some good banter back and forth between those guys.
Absolutely.
You also brought up, was it David? Not David Haye. David Price.
David Price, yeah.
That's right. David Price is obviously getting ready to come back. I think David Price would definitely have to put a couple of wins together first. He's going to have to prove to the boxing public that he's learned, that he actually has a chance. And if he could do that, if he could put some good wins together, he's a big, strong, tall, sturdy-looking fighter. I think that they can maybe sell that fight if Price can manage to put the wins together that's necessary to make that fight worth watching and worth people paying for. And besides that, everyone wants to see somebody get knocked out, right? You got a power puncher like Anthony Joshua, and then you got a guy in David Price who could crack, but also has a very weak chin and low punch resistance at this stage in his career, unfortunately. So that makes for a good fight, and that fight ends in a knockout. So it's a fight that could definitely be sold. Another fight that I think is going to be possible in the near future is going to be a Joseph Parker fight. Obviously, this is a very risky fight here because both of these guys, very talented, young, raw, and both looking like they're going to meet at a very young point and stage in their career. But from what I'm hearing, it appears that Parker's going to position himself to be the mandatory for that IBF World's Heavyweight title. What do you think about that fight if that happens? Because that's going to be a fight that's going to be happening very soon, for Anthony Joshua if Parker can position himself to be the mandatory. So what would you think about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If we assume that Anthony Joshua beats Charles Martin and then has won maybe 2 voluntaries, then I understand he may have to fight Joseph Parker as a mandatory in January 2017. So with that being the case, Joshua is a far more experienced fighter for that fight than he is as we discussed today. He's at this point, we're assuming he's beaten Charles Martin, he's maybe beaten a Derek Chisora, he's beaten a David Price. Now, the problem with Joseph Parker, and I rate Joseph Parker very highly, I've been watching him for a long time and, discussing him online for a while, but the problem is he has just not had the fights yet to prepare him for that type of opponent. And as a result, we are seeing mistakes slipping into his game. I mean, his last fight against Jason Bergman, he didn't look too strong in that fight, and that's understandable because he's a prospect, he's very young, I think he's only 23 and he's still learning his game. But to go straight from that fight to a world title fight against the guy who's beaten at this point Charles Martin, Derek Chisora, David Price, Dillian White, it's a big jump. It's a big jump. Now the one thing that makes me think this fight is really interesting is I constantly have memories of Anthony Joshua in the second round against Dillian White, getting hurt, getting hit to the body, getting hit on the chin, looking like he was running out of stamina, and I personally think a guy like Joseph Parker, who's so explosive, well conditioned, fast hands, combinations, I don't think Joseph Parker would have let Joshua off the hook in that second round like Dillian Whyte did. And that's why I think this fight is very, very interesting. You know, Parker, he's defensively a bit weak, but so is Joshua. They're both guys who need to use their jab a bit more. You know, they're both big power punchers there. There's big similarities between them, and I see it being a tight fight. Having said that, if Joshua has these big world title fights this year and Joseph Parker doesn't step up markedly in level of opposition, you'd maybe lean towards Joshua on that basis.
Yeah, I agree with you because, you know, at that particular point in time, Anthony Joshua definitely would have more experience. He would already have the IBF title. And obviously by then, he will have been on that type of a stage for a few fights by that point in time. And I think that experience level would definitely probably play a role in that fight happening. I will say, though, you know, if you're Joseph Parker, you probably still want to try to fight Joshua sooner than later because the longer you wait and the more experience, the more confidence that Anthony Joshua develops, it's the more dangerous of a fight it becomes for Joseph Parker. So maybe your feeling, if you're on his team, is, okay, maybe we could catch Joshua when he's kind of young. He's still not at a supreme confident level because you listen to Joshua talk, and obviously he believes in his ability as a fighter. But, you know, when you bring up certain names, you could definitely hear him say, well, I don't think I'm ready for that fighter yet. I don't think I'm ready for this fighter yet. So he still hasn't developed that supreme confidence that every guy he gets in the ring with, you know, he could really beat. Even though he does have that type of talent, he's that special to where that is possible, to where he has a chance in every fight. You know, he has to believe in himself. You know, so I think that that's where these next fights are going to be very key and pivotal for Joshua to build confidence. And this is where you don't want him to have any road bumps. So we will see. You know, I'm hearing that Carlos Takam is a possible opponent for Joseph Parker. And if that fight takes place, I think that's a good fight that would give Joseph Parker some really good experience. It's a credible name. You know, good, strong fighter with knockout power. Obviously, he lost to Alexander Povetkin, but just the fact that he's been on that level, and, you know, to get him on your resume would be a great thing for Joseph Parker moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. Takam is actually an underrated fighter for me. He did very well against Mike Perez, very well in that fight. That was when Mike Perez was undefeated and looking like a real good fighter at the time. Takam scored a draw. He beat Tony Thompson. I think Tony Thompson had 2 wins over Odlanair Solis, 2 wins over David Price, and, you know, he went out and beat him and, you know, really swarmed all over him for the entire duration of that fight and made it so difficult for Thompson. And then, you know, the Povetkin fight, everyone remembers that fight because of the knockout, but I think they were 8 rounds in and most of the judges had it about even. You know, Takam was boxing in that fight. He was boxing from range against Povetkin, and people forget now that he was actually causing Povetkin some problems in that fight. You know, Takam he's really underrated for me.
Fantastic points, man. I agree 100%. So, you know, that's why I think that would be a big win for Joseph Parker if he manages to step up and get that under his belt. You know, so we will see what happens, man. So, do you think that the David Haye fight and the Tyson Fury fight, do you see those fights happening a lot farther down the line? And say that they do happen at a point in time where Joshua is more experienced. How much of a chance do you give him in those fights?
I think summer 2017 is very realistic for those kind of fights, to be honest. You know, I think that Eddie Hearn is hungry for the big fights and the big money. So I do think they'll happen next year. You know, that would be my suspicion. I've got to say, based on what I've seen now, and I may change my opinion dependent on how, you know, Joshua performs. Based on what I've seen now, I would quite confidently predict both of those guys to beat Joshua. You know, Joshua, he's a very, very good offensive fighter, but I see a lot of flaws and a lot of development areas defensively. And I just think that if David Haye was able to breach those defences, he would have the power to you know, to knock Anthony Joshua out. Clearly, David Haye isn't getting any younger, but I just see the way David Haye fights, with his speed, with his agility, with his precision, he could kind of literally explode his way through the Joshua defence, and at this point, I think he could stop Anthony Joshua. As for Tyson Fury, For me, Tyson Fury is a uniquely awkward, difficult opponent. He is he's the complete opposite of Anthony Joshua. You know, Anthony Joshua, I see him as a very muscular, sort of stiff, rigid fighter. You know, very upright. He's someone who is a manufactured fighter. You know, he's not an instinctive fighter. You look at Tyson Fury when the bullets are coming at him, he's leaning on the ropes, he's bending at the waist, he's rolling, his head is moving. You know, Joshua, I don't see those natural fighting instincts. He's quite upright, quite static with his head movement. And I don't think he's very comfortable when punches are being thrown at him. He tightens up, he stiffens up for me, and he's vulnerable. You know, Tyson Fury, with his movement, with his awkwardness, I just think Tyson Fury is possibly the best pure boxer in heavyweight boxing right now. And I think he could have too much for Anthony Joshua.
I agree with you 1,000%, man. Great points. You know, that's kind of the knock on Joshua, right? That he's a little bit stiff, a little bit robotic.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys who, unlike Tyson Fury, who shifts from offense to defense so well. He's so fluid. You know, Joshua could be kind of uptight in the ring sometimes. And sometimes it's kind of like, okay, now I'm on offense. All right, now I'm going to defense. And he can't really, you know, shift those two different things the right way and really combine them in the right necessary way that he would need to if he's facing a guy like Tyson Fury, who brings so many dimensions to the table. Then, of course, you talk about David Haye. We all know that David Haye, man, if he were to catch, you know, Anthony Joshua with the same shot that Dillian White caught Joshua with, you know, it would be hook right, good night, for sure. You know, I don't think Joshua would get up from that or recover. So, you know, David Haye has that type of explosive power. So the thing for Joshua is going to be learning in these fights. What is he learning? Is he improving? You know, I really am hoping that in this Charles Martin fight, we get a lot of answers on that, and hopefully he develops and uses his jab more. I've heard a lot of people say that he has a jab. You know, he just doesn't use it enough, which, I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't use it, then what's really the point of having it, right? So I think he needs to do that because he's a guy who likes to get on the inside. And to get on the inside versus the talented fighters, you're not going to be able to just walk through the front door like he did versus Dillian White. It's not going to work. You're going to have to probe your way in. You're going to have to systematically come in through feints, head movement, keeping your opponent off balance, you know, and coming in properly to where you're not putting yourself at too much risk defensively.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Joshua, for me, has actually got a very good jab. The problem is he doesn't use it in an educated manner. You know, he throws the jab just for the sake of it. I'd like to see him doubling up the jab. I'd like to see him jabbing to the body, then jabbing to the head. I'd like to see him using it as a real weapon to open up his opponent. And he's never been in with a guy before. Well, he had. Sorry, I'm saying Charles Martin is the first good big guy he's been in with. I mean, he has fought big guys before, like Gary Cornish, for example, but that fight was over so quickly, it almost doesn't count as a learning experience, you know. And against a guy like Charles Martin, who not only is 6'5", but also is a southpaw, it's going to be very interesting to see how Joshua uses that jab. You know, Martin's jab for me is underrated. People forget that, you know, forget about the injury that Glazkov suffered. How were people scoring that fight in the first 3 rounds? And I had it 3-0 to Martin because of the jab. You know, Martin is a good boxer. He's a thinking boxer.
I'm with you.